Hello everyone and welcome back to the garage. This is part 2 of the BMW running issues. If you haven't seen part 1, I'll leave a link in the description, or you can just check my channel and you'll find it there. So yeah, in this part we're going to find the issue and finally fix the bike. So I'm back working on the BMW again. It's probably been a week since I've touched it because I've had other commitments. And yeah, I believe we're getting close to the problem now. Last time I checked the injector flow rate and that proved to be good, which was a surprise to me, I have to be honest. I was expecting it to be at the injector because, as I said before, this bike sat for 10 years, so I was expecting the injector to be clogged up or full of varnish, but it wasn't, so it's something else. So I think it's worth doing a quick recap of what I've done so far. So I've measured the O2 sensor reading, which was settling at about 0.1 volts before the bike was stalling, so indicating a very lean running bike. As soon as I sprayed brake cleaner near the intake, it would go to 0.9 or thereabouts, 0.9 volts, which makes sense. That sort of makes me believe the O2 sensor is doing its job. Next, I probed the injector, the back of the injector, and measured the opening time, and that seemed to be alright. The computer was reacting to brake cleaner. It seemed to do its job. I spoke with someone recently, and apparently this bike at idle with the warm engine should have an opening time on the injector of 2 milliseconds. So I had an opening time of 3.4 or 3.5 milliseconds before it died. So that's all good. Injector flow rate is probably slightly more than it needs to be. It should be 315 milliliters per minute at 3 bar, but we measured 360 milliliters per minute at 3.5 bar, so it's close to where it should be. Fuel pressure was good, everything else was fine, so the bike should actually run slightly rich probably, but it wasn't. So the only other explanation for that would be probably it's getting air through somewhere, and those of you who are smarter than me and more familiar with these bikes probably are shouting now that that's where I should start. But I'm neither of these things, so I start where I can. So I've already checked the rubber intake manifold under the throttle body, and that seems to be fine. I couldn't find any leaks. I sprayed brake cleaner around it to see if it changes anything. I can't visually see any rips or holes or anything, so I assume that's fine for now. But this bike also has an ICV, an idle control valve. So this is the ICV, the idle control valve, which is just a stepper motor in this case, with a little plunger in there. We'll have a look at that in a bit. And in the throttle body we can see there's this intake port right there. So for those of you less familiar with the way this is supposed to work, is unlike carb bikes or some of the first fuel injected systems where the butterfly valve actually stayed just slightly, I don't know if you can see that, just slightly open to allow some air to get past, and you adjust the idler with a screw. In this case, the butterfly valve is nearly fully closed, but the engine still needs some air to run at idle. So that's where this guy comes in. So it's just a valve that allows air to pass through this port, past the butterfly valve and under the throttle body into the engine. So it's a pretty simple job, but it needs to be sort of fairly accurate, because otherwise the bike's just not going to run right. And yes, I should have suspected this from the beginning when I probed the O2 sensor and noticed that the bike is very lean at idle, but as soon as I rev it past 2.5–3,000 RPM, the bike's running fine. So that could be a very good indication that this is the issue, because this doesn't do much after certain revs. So it could be that that's the issue, but I want to prove that rather than just replacing parts or just taking it out and see what happens. I've got the scope attached to the bike again. I've back probed the O2 sensor to get a reading on that. Back probed the fuel injector as well, because I want to see how the opening time varies. And the port I showed you for the ICV, when the bike is running, I'm going to try to block that with my finger or something to just restrict the airflow and see if that changes the mixture. If it does, it's very likely that proves that it's our issue. So I stopped the reading while the bike was running just to see what's going on. I've decided to show it this way rather than with the bike running, because it's just too loud and it's harder to explain what's happening. So the blue line is my O2 sensor, and we can see that's running at just about 0.1 volts, between 0 and 0.2. So yeah, around roughly 0.1 volts. So that's indicating still a lean mixture. And the red line is my injector. So you can see the injector pulsing or opening. I've measured that, and that's nearly 4.3 4.3 seconds, for 4.3 milliseconds. So it's quite a big opening time. Should make a pretty rich mixture, I would say, but the bike's still running lean. So now let's try to get the same reading, but try to block the ICV and see what changes. So I hope you can see the other screen now, but it's just on 0.1 volt. I'm blocking the port now. There's quite a lot of flow through it. So what I'm going to do now is remove the ICP and give it a clean. Also remove the TPS, the throttle position sensor, and yeah, give that a clean as well, because it's all oily from the overfilled tank, and hope we can fix it and make it run smooth. So here we are with the ICV and throttle position sensor or potentiometer off the bike. So I'm going to start with this one. It should work just fine, but I'm going to give it a good clean with contact cleaner, clean the connector as well, maybe test this with a multimeter, put it back on the bike. So in order to test it, I'm just going to grab my multimeter, 2 alligator clips, put them on the first two wires. So I'm not sure what the values are supposed to be, but I'm just looking for a smooth operation. That looks fine. Let's try the other side. The other side should do the opposite now. Starts at the higher value. It should go down. So yeah, this seems to be functioning properly. I'm just going to put it back on the bike now, and we'll move on to the actual problem. So here we are with the idle control valve. How does this work? I think I mentioned before, the butterfly valve just closes completely, or almost completely. There's still a tiny gap there. And this idle control valve just opens to allow air to pass from one side to the other, so the engine still gets some air. This is very likely a 4-wire stepper motor without any sort of feedback. And the way this works, when you turn off the bike, this plunger advances fully and closes the gap, or closes the port. When you turn on the bike, the stepper motor tries to advance again. It probably can't, so it just misses steps. And once it's done a set number of steps, it just goes back a few to allow some air. And in theory, this should adjust while the bike is running. This is definitely doing something. The motor works and it's getting a signal from the computer. So the only other thing I can think of as being the problem is possibly this, for some reason, not being able to advance out fully. So even when it thinks it's close, there's still a gap there. And then when it backs up, it leaves a gap too big. But the question is, why doesn't the computer try to adjust that and push it back out a bit? I don't know, but we're gonna give it a good clean and see if we can find the problem. So assembling this might be a bit tricky, because you can start the threads, but you can only go so far, and then you have to align those notches with the grooves in the slider or in the plunger, and then the stepper motor has to pull it in. So I don't have a stepper motor controller here, so I'm just gonna plug it back in, cycle the key, as in hold it tight. The computer tries to push it out, but it can't. Hopefully I can hold it in, and then once it finishes that, it's going to try to back it out. I'm just going to pull it back in a bit, and before I put them back on, I'm just going to put some lithium grease on them. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of debris in there as well. Before I do anything else, I'm going to give this a bit of a clean, and also the throttle body, try to get that oil off, and we'll move on. So clean the bore up a bit, looks much better. I'm just going to plug this in now. Hold it tight and cycle the key. There we go. Now hold it tight again, because once we turn it off, it's going to push it out. There we go. Let's see what it does when we turn it on again. Pushes it out and backs it up a bit. And the same thing when we turn it off. Push it out. That should be fully closed now. Just gonna cycle the key so I push it all the way in. Easier to assemble. Okay, pull it tight, turn it off, and wait for it. And there we go. Ready to put back in. Just gonna spray it with some silicone oil. And put it back in. Right, it's all in now. But how do I test it? How do I know this is closing completely or opening the right amount? What I want to try and do, without doing too much work or removing too much stuff, is just cycle the key. I'm going to turn off the ignition. This should push it out completely, so close that port, unplug it, start the bike, and I should feel very little or no vacuum there. The bike's going to run very lumpy. Let's try and start the bike. Yes, the bike doesn't even want to start, probably doesn't have enough air. I do feel a tiny bit of vacuum there, so that cap is not closing completely. Just the throttle bit to give it some air and try again. So yeah, the bike doesn't want to idle, not surprisingly, it just probably does not have enough air. But I'm surprised I still feel a bit of vacuum there, so obviously that cap is not closing completely. So the bike was running fine, with a measured voltage at the O2 sensor of about 0.4 to 0.5 volts. But after installing the airbox, the voltage would slowly drop, the bike would start to run a bit lumpy and die again. It runs longer and better than before, so we have improved it, but there's still something wrong. What I have noticed is that as soon as I unplug the air temperature sensor, the bike runs fine, keeps a nice idle and a steady mixture. So initially I checked the intake temperature sensor and I assumed it was fine. I had a resistance and it seemed to react when I apply heat. So although I didn't have a known good value to compare it with, I assumed it's fine. But after putting the bike together and noticing a tendency to run lean again with the sensor plugged in, and it was fine with the sensor unplugged, I assumed that this may not be correct. So I got a new one and we can straight away see the difference. This one, the old one's reading 1.9 kilo ohms, while the new one is reading 6.8, so quite a big difference. And if we just apply a bit of heat to both, both reacting, but strangely in different ways. The old one is increasing its resistance, while the new one is going down. So here we go, I've got the new sensor plugged in, and I can just start the bike and see what it's doing now. So it's staying very steadily at about 0.45 volts, which is great. That's a very good mixture. So it would appear that the bike is fixed, but I've got a few more bits to change out before I put it all back together, and tomorrow it needs to go to the MOT station. So here are the other bits it's gonna get. It's gonna get a new air filter, a new fuel filter, which is pretty expensive, and because the old ICV was clean, the owner decided to it's worth spending the money on a new one, just to be on the safe side and make sure it works properly. And he was also quite concerned about the spoot, and although it doesn't seem to be leaking now, the old one was quite covered in oil, and it is kind of old now, it's over 20 years old. So although it's not very cheap, again, we got a new one of these. So yeah, let's put these on and have this bike done. One thing that I spotted just now, I should have noticed earlier, is that this throttle cable it's got some damage. So this will need replacing. It's quite a big safety concern, I think. There we go, it's all done. This video is probably already long enough, so I won't bore you with putting everything back together, putting the plastics and the shield underneath. That's all pretty easy. So yeah, let's give it one more try. Make sure everything still runs. Hope this was helpful, and yeah, thanks for watching and hope to see you again soon.